So Trump's trade threat expired before the tariff ever reached the border. Washington announced a 50% duty on selected Canadian goods. Nearly $20 billion in trade was placed under a 30-day clock ending on August 19th. The purpose was obvious: create enough fear inside Canadian factories, provincial governments, banks, and retirement portfolios that Mark Carney would arrive at the negotiating table carrying concessions. But the first days produced the opposite movement. Canada kept its European Defence Agreement. It kept Britain's TPP accession on schedule. It kept a $5 billion trade corridor program moving. It kept more than 20 new economic and security partnerships in place. And Washington, not Ottawa, began publicly asking for an interim arrangement while admitting the hardest USMCA disputes could continue into 2027. The tariff remained alive on paper. The threat had already expired as a strategy. Warren Buffett's economic logic cuts through the political language with one sentence: a deadline stops being leverage when the other side prepared for the day after it. Carney's backup plan did not remove Canada's exposure. A 50% duty on nearly $20 billion can still cancel orders, reduce shifts, weaken the Canadian dollar, and damage American importers that rely on Canadian goods. But pressure is only successful when it changes the decision it was designed to change. Washington wanted Canada to suspend diversification and return to dependence. Canada responded by accelerating the diversification it had already funded. When you hear what happened inside the reconstructed Ottawa briefing, why August 19 was written beside February 14, and why one official quietly moved the American tariff folder underneath a Canadian contingency binder, you will understand why the real story is not whether the duty takes effect. It is whether the duty can still buy what Washington wanted. Hit subscribe because the tariff clock is public, while the backup plan is already moving through contracts, ports, procurement systems, and boardrooms. And the deeper problem for Washington is that Carney's plan was not assembled during those 30 days. It was built before the threat arrived. Let me give you the full context, because this confrontation did not begin with the July 20 proclamation. For decades, Canada's economic model rested on a rational concentration of risk. The United States was the closest market, largest source of investment, the most important customer for Canadian goods, and the indispensable partner in continental defense. Auto parts crossed the border several times before a vehicle was completed. Canadian crude flowed into American refineries through pipelines built over generations. Electricity moved through integrated grids. Railways, banks, manufacturers, farmers, and pension funds planned around a border governed by stable agreements. The system produced efficiency. It also produced a dangerous assumption. Canada assumed that American access would remain institutional, even when politics became hostile. Companies financed plants with 30-year lives because they believed trade rules would survive 4-year election cycles. Workers built careers in industries designed for one dominant customer, because the North American framework was treated as durable infrastructure. The United States possessed immense leverage, but agreements were supposed to prevent that leverage from becoming a recurring threat. Then the rules began to feel temporary. Steel and aluminum faced tariffs. Automobile regulations became bargaining weapons. Softwood lumber remained unresolved. Public language moved from negotiation toward punishment. On July 1, Washington declined to grant the USMCA another clean 16-year extension. The agreement remained in force, but annual reviews began and a 10-year countdown toward possible expiration in 2036 started. For a government, 10 years sounds distant. For a factory, mine, port, or pension investment, 10 years can be the middle of the asset's useful life. Then Washington invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. According to the White House, 3 proclamations imposed additional 50% duties on selected Canadian products connected to vehicles, dairy, and alcoholic beverages. The measures were scheduled for 12:01 a.m. on August 19 and would apply to covered goods even where they otherwise qualified under USMCA. According to Reuters, the affected trade represented nearly $20 billion. The architecture of the threat was deliberate. 50% created the headline. Nearly $20 billion created concentrated economic pain. 30 days created a countdown. But Ottawa had spent the previous year building a response to precisely this kind of uncertainty. According to the European Council, Canada signed an agreement on February 14th allowing Canadian companies and products to participate in procurement under Europe's Safe Defence Instrument. The agreement was formally concluded on June 15th, making Canada the first non-European participant in a mechanism backed by up to €150 billion in financing. The first Canadian-linked contract had already been announced. More than $10 million for tactical radios for Polish Cyber Command, using nearly 100 Canadian suppliers and extending deliveries through 2030. According to Global Affairs Canada, Canada ratified Britain's accession to the CTPP on July 3rd. The protocol was scheduled to take effect between Canada and the United Kingdom on September 1st, expanding common rules across a market of more than 598 million people. According to Transport Canada, Ottawa launched a $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund on March 4th, along with $1 billion for Arctic infrastructure. Projects were being assessed to expand ports, railways, airports, northern roads, digital systems, and routes capable of reaching non-American markets. Canada also had tariff response financing already operating. A $1 billion business development bank program, additional regional funding, and strategic industrial support had been designed to help affected companies preserve jobs, improve productivity, and find new markets. This was the preparation contrast Washington failed to see. The American side prepared a proclamation. The Canadian side prepared financing, market access, infrastructure, and procurement alternatives. Most Americans do not realize what that means. Canada still cannot replace the United States in 30 days. It does not need to. A backup plan works when it prevents a crisis from forcing the worst possible decision. For Ottawa, the emotional turning point came when the deadline was treated as proof that Canada should reverse arrangements signed months earlier. That was the moment the tariff stopped being only a commercial dispute and became a test of whether American pressure could veto Canadian strategy. And then Carney asked his officials to place every date, every dollar, and every operating program on one table. What follows is a composite reconstruction based on official documents, public statements, reported negotiating positions, and the known market timeline. It is not a verbatim transcript of a private meeting. The room is inside the Prime Minister's office complex in Ottawa, behind a security door where mobile phones are collected. The table is pale maple. Recessed lights cast a cold white line down the center. A Canadian flag stands near a wall screen showing North America, the Atlantic, Europe, and the Pacific. The southern trade routes are thick red lines. The alternatives are thinner blue and green lines. They are not large enough to replace the red lines. They are real enough to change the conversation. 4 binders sit in front of Carney. The first is white and carries the American proclamations. A yellow tab marks August 19. The second is red. Across its cover, 50%. Nearly $20 billion, 30 days. The third is blue. Inside are the SAFE agreement signed February 14th, the European Council conclusion dated June 15th, the first Canadian contract, nearly 100 suppliers, and deliveries extending through 2030. The fourth is gray. It contains Britain's CTPP accession protocol, Canada's July 30 ratification, and the September 1 effective date. At the end of the table is a black contingency binder containing the $5 billion corridor program, the $1 billion Arctic Fund, emergency business financing, provincial exposure maps, and domestic procurement measures. The tariff is one folder. The backup plan is everything else. The trade minister begins with the exposure. Covered products entering the United States after 12:01 a.m. on August 19 could face an additional 50% duty. Nearly $20 billion is a manageable fraction of the bilateral relationship. It is not manageable for a company whose American sales represent most of its revenue. A screen displays individual facilities, a cement operation, a dairy processor, a beverage exporter, a clothing manufacturer, a furniture company, a sporting goods supplier, a trucking firm serving several of them. The labor official describes the order of damage. Overtime disappears first. Temporary workers are released. Maintenance is postponed. Investment is frozen. Permanent layoffs come later, after hope has already left the town. Carney asks how much can be redirected before August 19th. The answer is immediate. Not enough. European contracts take time. British procurement opportunities require qualification. New customers require credit, standards, logistics, and trust. A port cannot be expanded in 30 days. Carney looks at the red binder. What is the minimum objective? Keep viable firms alive. Preserve payrolls. Prevent banks from turning a tariff shock into a credit crisis. Then he looks at the blue binder. What is the strategic objective? The defense official answers slowly. Make sure the next threat has fewer targets. The SAFE agreement is opened. February 14th is visible. The first contract is placed beside it. More than $10 million. Nearly 100 Canadian suppliers. Deliveries through 2030. Carney lifts the summary. This does not replace nearly $20 billion. No. Then why is it here? Because it proves the system is operating. Silence. 5 seconds. Then 10. The ventilation system can be heard above the ceiling. Condensation moves down a water glass beside the August 19 tab. An aide quietly moves the glass away. The contract's face value is small. Its strategic value is that Canadian companies have crossed from eligibility into procurement. Engineers know the standards. Suppliers have references. European buyers now have a Canadian delivery chain. Carney turns to the grey binder. Britain's TPP accession takes effect between the two countries on September 1, 13 days after the tariff date. It does not replace the American market. It creates another rules-based channel that does not depend on Washington. Then the black contingency binder is opened. The corridor program is evaluating proposals. The Arctic Fund connects infrastructure, trade, and sovereignty. Business financing can keep exposed firms alive. Domestic procurement can support Canadian suppliers. Carney writes 2 dates, August 19, September 1. A secure line opens with Washington. The exact words are not public. The reconstructed exchange reflects the positions both governments have stated. The American lead says the 30-day period is an opportunity for Canada to address discrimination involving vehicles, alcohol, and dairy. If Ottawa changes course, the proclamations can be reduced, modified, or terminated. The Canadian lead asks what change course means. Washington lists market access, provincial restrictions, automobile treatment, and broader USCA concerns. Then comes the central request. Canada should avoid deepening arrangements that disadvantage American suppliers while negotiations continue. Carney slides the blue folder toward the microphone. The European agreement was signed on February 14th, he says in the reconstruction. The first contract is awarded. The British protocol is ratified. The corridor program is operating. Which part are you asking Canada to postpone? The answer is indirect. Canada must demonstrate that American access remains its priority. Carney looks at the map. The red lines remain the thickest. American access is economically essential, he says. American approval is not. Silence comes through the line. 5 seconds. Then 10. Nobody looks triumphant. Nearly $20 billion is still exposed. 50% is still real. August 19th is still approaching. The American lead returns to the deadline. You have 30 days. Carney's reply is quiet. We used the previous 12 months. That is the climactic moment. Washington is counting from the proclamation forward. Canada is counting from preparation backward. Canada will negotiate legitimate disputes, Carney says. It will not reverse completed agreements, suspend operating programs, or abandon procurement channels for temporary relief. Emergency financing will protect exposed firms. Infrastructure and overseas market development will continue even if the tariff is withdrawn. The American official asks whether Canada is treating the tariff as permanent. No, Carney says. We are treating unpredictability as permanent. The call ends. The screen goes black. An aide gathers the white tariff folder and places it beneath the black contingency binder. The motion is practical. Everyone sees the image. The thread is physically underneath the backup plan. The water glasses remain almost completely full. And by the time Washington publicly asked for an interim arrangement, the 30-day threat had failed to stop a single major element of Carney's strategy. The aftermath moved quickly because the contradiction was now visible in public. On July 20th, Washington announced the 50% duties on nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods. The measures were scheduled for August 19th. The message was that Canada had 30 days to reconsider. On July 21, Carney convened Canada's premiers and emphasized that the country had already signed more than 20 new economic and security partnerships. Provincial leaders demanded protection for vulnerable workers, but the public response remained coordinated. Canada did not announce that it would suspend European access. It did not postpone British TPP implementation. It did not freeze the $5 billion corridor program. On July 22nd, the United States Trade Representative told senators that Washington wanted interim arrangements with Canada and Mexico by the end of the year. He also acknowledged that major USCA issues involving automobiles, labor, environmental provisions, and rules of origin could continue into 2027. A 30-day threat had become a request for negotiating time. According to Reuters, formal Canada-US talks had not begun when the new tariff threat was announced. while the United States and Mexico were already further into a separate process. That was the operational weakness beneath the proclamation. Washington had started the countdown before constructing the complete negotiation that might stop it. Markets registered the danger. The Canadian dollar fell to a one-week low near 1.4104 to the US dollar, approximately 70.9 American cents. Investors reduced expectations for Bank of Canada tightening. The gap between Canadian and American two-year yields widened to roughly 144.5 basis points. The following day, the currency recovered part of the loss as oil prices rose. This was not a market declaration of Canadian victory, it was something more restrained. Markets priced vulnerability without pricing collapse. The public statements from both sides could not have been more revealing. Washington described the tariffs as protection for American workers and a response to discrimination. Ottawa described them as another reason to defend Canadian workers while continuing diversification. One side presented pressure. The other presented endurance. Then the leaks began to circulate through business associations and provincial offices. American importers were asking whether shipments could be advanced before August 19. Canadian exporters were asking banks for credit. U.S. companies dependent on Canadian cement and manufactured inputs were preparing exclusion requests. Canadian defense suppliers were studying European tenders. Port authorities were revisiting proposals under the $5 billion corridor fund. The threat had not disappeared. The behavior it was designed to stop was accelerating. The most devastating irony appeared in the exemptions. The White House excluded energy, potash, critical minerals, fish, and goods already covered by certain national security tariffs. Washington wanted to prove that Canada needed the American market, but the exclusions showed where American industry still needed Canada. The door could not be locked completely because American companies were standing inside it. Then Canada canceled the joint celebration for the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. The bridge would still connect Windsor and Detroit. Trucks would still carry integrated North American commerce across it. But the two governments could no longer comfortably stand together to celebrate a structure built to represent permanence. A bridge intended to deepen the relationship opened while both countries were preparing for a less dependable one. And then Warren Buffett translated the spectacle into the language that markets understand. Buffett's economic translation begins with a distinction political leaders often avoid. A tariff can remain legally valid after its strategic purpose has expired. The 50% duty is not imaginary. If it takes effect on August 19th, covered Canadian goods can become dramatically more expensive inside the United States. Nearly $20 billion in trade can be disrupted. Orders can be canceled. A company with a narrow margin can become uncompetitive overnight. American importers can pass part of the cost to consumers or absorb it through lower profits. But the stated objective is not merely to collect money at the border. It is to change Canadian behavior. That is where the threat has weakened. Canada did not stop implementing SAFE. It did not reverse the February 14 agreement. It did not abandon the first European contract using nearly 100 Canadian suppliers. It did not delay the September 1 British CH. It did not shut the $5 billion corridor program. It did not dismantle emergency business financing or domestic procurement measures. The tariff may still impose a cost. It failed to cancel the backup plan. Buffett would evaluate that outcome the way he evaluates management under pressure. The first question is not whether the company avoided every loss. It is whether management preserved liquidity, protected the core franchise, and prevented temporary pressure from forcing a permanent mistake. Carney's backup plan performs those functions imperfectly but recognizably. Emergency financing protects liquidity. Overseas market access protects future revenue. Domestic procurement preserves industrial capacity. Trade corridors reduce logistical dependence. Provincial coordination protects political credibility. None of those assets produces instant immunity. That is not what a backup plan does. A backup generator does not make a storm disappear. It keeps the hospital operating while the main line is unstable. The €150 billion safe figure must also be understood honestly. Canada does not receive €150 billion. European member states use that financing for procurement, and Canadian companies must compete under agreed rules. Some bids will fail. Some partnerships will never become contracts. But the first contract matters because it proves the mechanism can convert access into revenue. More than $10 million is small beside nearly $20 billion. Nearly 100 suppliers and deliveries through 2030 are not small as an industrial precedent. Engineers learn standards. Companies obtain references. European buyers learn which Canadian suppliers can deliver. The second contract begins from a stronger position than the first. That is compounding. In more than 60 years of buying companies, allocating capital, and watching powerful businesses lose customers through arrogance, Warren Buffett has returned to a simple principle: never make the other side build a backup plan and then assume they will dismantle it when the immediate dispute ends. Backup plans acquire owners. A port expansion has construction workers, lenders, local governments, and customers. A defense contract has engineers, suppliers, military users, and political sponsors. A trade agreement has exporters, law firms, banks, and procurement teams. Once those interests form, diversification stops being a temporary government preference. It becomes a constituency. That is why even a future removal of the 50% tariff would not restore the old leverage automatically. The Canadian company that spent money qualifying in Europe will still bid in Europe. The province that planned an Atlantic route will still want the route. The pension fund that priced American political risk will not forget the calculation. The universal principle is straightforward. Leverage is most valuable before it is visibly abused. Once a partner sees the mechanism, the partner begins designing around it. Washington revealed the mechanism with unusual clarity. 50%. Nearly $20 billion. 30 days. Carney answered with equally clear assurance. February 14th. September 1. $5 billion. Contracts through 2030. Buffett's devastating verdict would be this: the tariff may still collect a payment, but it can no longer collect obedience. Pause on that. America can still win concessions on dairy, alcohol, vehicles, or rules of origin. Canada can still suffer economic damage, but a threat designed to stop the backup plan has become the strongest argument for completing it. And the consequences of that reversal now extend far beyond the customs categories listed in the proclamations. The first cascading consequence is economic geography. The $5 billion corridor program is not a press release once ports, rail lines, airports, and logistics systems receive funding. Those assets lower the cost of reaching customers outside the United States. A future administration may remove the tariff, but concrete does not unpour itself. Rail and shipping networks do not automatically return to the old route. The second consequence is industrial policy. Canada's participation in Europe's SAFE system gives defense companies a reason to build capabilities that serve more than one customer. The first contract, involving nearly 100 Canadian suppliers, creates experience in secure communications, engineering, certification, and military delivery. Domestic procurement measures lowering the strategic threshold from $25 million to $5 million give more Canadian firms a reason to remain inside the national industrial base. Permanent protection can create inefficiency. It can also prevent a tariff shock from destroying suppliers Canada will need in the next crisis. The third consequence reaches jobs and retirement security. The backup plan is long-term. Workers live in the short term. A company facing a 50% duty on August 19 cannot pay wages with a possible European tender 3 years from now. Ottawa will need emergency credit, wage support, retraining, and targeted assistance that protects viable firms without preserving every failed business model indefinitely. For older households, the risk travels through pension funds, banks, railways, manufacturers, commercial property, and the Canadian dollar. American retirees are not insulated. A tariff on Canadian cement, food, clothing, or manufactured inputs can appear as higher consumer prices, weaker corporate earnings, or delayed construction. Now, before I continue, I want to quickly mention something every American over 60 needs to see right now. Everything we have been covering, the tariffs, inflation, market volatility, and the pressure this trade war can place on retirement savings, I have compiled into a practical guide called the Buffett Blueprint. It applies Warren Buffett's long-term investment principles to the specific risks this trade conflict creates for your retirement. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income investments are all covered, along with a straightforward protection plan you can begin using this week. The link is directly below this video and in the pinned comment. It is called the Buffett Blueprint. And for calm, evidence-based coverage of what these trade decisions could mean for your money, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Now let's return to the wider consequences of Carney's strategy. The fourth consequence is political inside Canada. Ontario sees autos and factories. Quebec sees dairy, aerospace, communications, and European defense work. Alberta and Saskatchewan see energy, potash, uranium, and export corridors. British Columbia sees Pacific access and ports. Atlantic Canada sees shipbuilding in Europe. The 30-day threat gives each region a different reason to support the same strategic conclusion. Canada requires more than one route. That coalition makes the backup plan difficult to reverse. A future government that abandons diversification for short-term tariff relief would strand provinces, companies, workers, and investors that have already organized around it. The fifth consequence is political inside the United States. Every tariff protects one interest and taxes another. An American producer may gain while an importer, builder, retailer, or manufacturer pays more. Exemptions for energy, potash, critical minerals, and fish reveal pressure's domestic limits. Washington can target nearly $20 billion. It cannot separate the Canadian and American economies cleanly without damaging industries on both sides. Every exemption request exposes another dependency. Every denied request expands the American cost. The sixth consequence reaches NORAD, Five Eyes, and the Arctic. Canada and the United States cannot diversify their geography. They share airspace, maritime approaches, intelligence networks, and defense infrastructure. The backup plan, therefore, does not replace continental security. It broadens Canadian procurement, industrial capacity, and international relationships around it. A more capable Canada can strengthen NORAD. Capability built because Canada doubts American predictability sends a different message. European defense ties, Arctic infrastructure, secure communications, and procurement partners reduce Washington's monopoly over Canadian choices, even when the alliance itself continues. The seventh consequence is international. Germany, France, Britain, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Poland are watching. They see a close American ally facing a 50% tariff under a 30-day deadline, while the larger negotiation may continue into 2027. They also see Canada activating Europe, the KIP-TPP, domestic procurement, and overseas infrastructure. The question in allied capitals is not whether America remains powerful, it is whether dependence on American power now requires insurance. China and Russia benefit whenever allies answer yes. They do not need Canada to change sides. They need Western governments spending money to protect themselves from one another. That is the devastating irony. A threat designed to preserve American centrality has accelerated the systems that make American centrality less automatic. Each layer multiplies the next. Tariffs justify financing. Financing preserves companies. Companies win alternative contracts. Contracts justify infrastructure. Infrastructure makes diversification practical. Diversification weakens future leverage. Weaker leverage invites greater pressure, and greater pressure accelerates the same process again. The tariff has a date, the feedback loop does not. The closing judgment must remain exact. Trump's trade threat has not expired legally. The proclamations remain scheduled for August 19. The 50% duty can still strike nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods. Companies can still lose orders. Workers can still lose shifts. The Canadian dollar can still weaken. And retirement portfolios can still absorb the cost of another unstable North American year. What expired was the original theory of the threat. Washington assumed 30 days would force Canada to choose between American access and its backup plan. Carney refused that choice. Canada will negotiate for American access while continuing the backup plan. The European agreement remains signed. SAFE remains open. Britain's KIP-TPP accession remains scheduled for September 1. The $5 billion corridor program remains active. Emergency financing remains available. More than 20 partnerships remain in motion. That is not independence from the United States. It is independence from waiting for the United States. The philosophical lesson is simple. A threat can change a price quickly. It cannot always change a strategy. Once a country has accepted the cost of building alternatives, additional pressure may strengthen the political case for completing them. The threatened party stops asking how to return to the old arrangement and begins asking how to ensure the next threat matters less. Warren Buffett's final verdict would be quiet and devastating. Trump set a 30-day clock. Carney arrived with a plan measured in decades. The white tariff folder still says August 19. The red binder still says 50% and nearly $20 billion. The blue folder still says February 14. Nearly 100 suppliers, and deliveries through 2030. The gray folder still says September 1. One side is measuring how much immediate pain it can create. The other is measuring how much permanent resilience it can build before the next deadline. Keep an eye on the interim arrangement, the first corridor awards, the next European contract, and every American industry asking for an exemption. The tariff may still begin, but the strategy behind it has already run out of time. Before you go, I mentioned this earlier, and I mean it. When a trade war begins affecting prices, markets, businesses, and retirement portfolios, hoping everything works itself out is not a protection plan. That is why I created the Buffett Blueprint. It is designed to help Americans over 60 understand how Warren Buffett's principles can be applied during periods of tariffs, inflation, and market uncertainty. Your 401k, your Social Security, and your fixed income investments, one clear plan, written in plain English, with practical steps you can begin using this week. The link is directly below this video and in the pinned comment. Look for the Buffett Blueprint. Subscribe to the channel for more clear, evidence-based analysis of the economic decisions affecting your retirement. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.